Have you ever found yourself lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering why you feel so hollow despite having everything you thought you wanted? Why does success taste like ash in your mouth? Why do the very achievements you work so hard for feel like betrayals of some deeper truth you cannot name? If this resonates with something in your chest, something that quickens and recoils at the same time, then you have stumbled upon a mystery that most will spend their entire lives avoiding. We are not here to discuss simple self-help platitudes or surface-level psychology. No, we are here to excavate something far more dangerous and far more sacred. We are here to speak of the ways you destroy your own joy, not through obvious failures or external circumstances, but through the subtle, unconscious patterns that turn you into your own executioner. The human psyche is a labyrinth, and happiness is not a destination you arrive at through willpower or positive thinking. It is a state of being that emerges when you stop waging war against yourself. But here is the cruel irony. The very mechanisms you develop to survive, to succeed, to be loved, are often the same mechanisms that strangle your capacity for genuine contentment. Most people believe that happiness is something they lack, something they must acquire through achievement, relationship, or circumstance. But what if I told you that happiness is not something you gain, but something you stop destroying? What if the prison you feel trapped in was built by your own hands, brick by unconscious brick, in the name of protection, perfection, or proving your worth? This is not a comfortable truth. It is not a truth that will make you feel better about yourself. It is a truth that will make you question everything you thought you knew about your own motivations, your own desires, your own definition of a life well lived. Because to recognize the ways you sabotage your happiness is to confront the shadow aspects of your personality, the parts of you that operate in darkness, convinced they are serving your highest good. I have spent years studying the hidden patterns that govern human behavior, the unconscious contracts we make with suffering, the ways we turn our gifts into curses and our strengths into chains. What I have discovered is that most people are not victims of circumstance, but architects of their own misery. Not because they are broken or weak, but because they are unconscious. They repeat the same destructive patterns while wondering why their lives feel like endless variations of the same disappointing theme. The 7 signs I am about to reveal are not just behaviors you can modify with a little effort and good intentions. They are archetypal patterns, ancient ways of being that run deeper than your conscious mind, deeper than your personal history, deeper than your individual psychology. They are the inherited wisdom of survival that has outlived its usefulness, the protective mechanisms that have become prisons, the strategies that once saved you but now slowly suffocate the very essence of who you truly are. Understanding these patterns requires a kind of psychological archaeology. You must be willing to dig beneath the surface of your daily consciousness and examine the foundations upon which your entire sense of self has been built. You must be willing to ask not just what you do, but why you do it. Not just what you want, but what you fear. Not just who you think you are, but who you were before the world taught you to be someone else. The first hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is something I call the perfection prison. On the surface, perfectionism appears to be a virtue. It drives achievement, creates excellence, and earns approval from others. But beneath this shining exterior lies a darker truth. Perfectionism is not about creating something beautiful in the world. It is about avoiding the shame of being seen as flawed ordinary or human. The perfectionist has made an unconscious bargain with life. They believe that if they can just be flawless enough, complete enough, accomplished enough, then they will finally be safe from criticism, rejection, or abandonment. But this bargain is a trap, because perfection is not a standard, but a moving target. No matter what they achieve, it is never enough. No matter how flawless their performance, they find new ways to fall short of their own impossible expectations. What makes this pattern so insidious is that it masquerades as ambition, as caring, as having high standards. The perfectionist tells themselves they are simply committed to excellence, but what they are actually committed to is the avoidance of vulnerability. They would rather exhaust themselves pursuing an impossible ideal than risk the exposure of being authentically, imperfectly human. I once worked with a woman who had built a successful career, a beautiful home, and what appeared to be a perfect life. Yet she came to me in despair, feeling empty and disconnected from everything she had created. As we explored her inner world, what emerged was a pattern that had begun in childhood. She had learned that love was conditional on performance, that approval was earned through achievement, that her worth as a human being was directly tied to her ability to exceed expectations. This woman had spent decades trying to perfect herself into lovability, but in doing so, she had created a life that felt like a museum. Beautiful to look at, but cold and lifeless to inhabit. She had optimized for external validation at the expense of internal aliveness. She had built a fortress of accomplishment around a heart that was slowly dying of loneliness. The perfectionist lives in a state of chronic dissatisfaction because they are always comparing their reality to an ideal that exists only in their imagination. They cannot enjoy their successes because they are already focused on the next goal, the next improvement, the next way to prove their worthiness. They cannot rest because rest feels like laziness. They cannot play because play feels like wasted time. They cannot be present because the present moment is always lacking something, always requiring optimization. But here is what the perfectionist does not understand. The very thing they are trying to avoid through perfection, the experience of being flawed and human, is actually the doorway to genuine happiness. Joy does not emerge from flawlessness, but from the courage to be imperfect. Love does not flow toward those who have no needs, but toward those who are brave enough to reveal their humanity. The perfection prison is not just about high standards or attention to detail. It is about the fundamental belief that you are not acceptable as you are, that your natural state is somehow insufficient, that you must constantly be improving, achieving, and proving yourself in order to deserve love, respect, or even your own approval. This pattern creates what I call the happiness mirage. The perfectionist believes that once they reach a certain level of achievement, once they fix all their flaws, once they create the perfect life, then they will finally be happy. But happiness keeps receding like a mirage in the desert, always just beyond reach, always requiring one more accomplishment, one more improvement, one more proof of worthiness. The cruel irony is that the perfectionist often achieves remarkable things. They build successful careers, create beautiful homes, maintain impressive social lives. From the outside, their lives appear enviable. But on the inside, they feel like frauds, like actors playing roles they never auditioned for, like prisoners in gilded cages of their own construction. The second hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the comparison trap. This is the unconscious habit of measuring your life against the lives of others, of using external benchmarks to determine your own worth, of believing that your value is relative rather than inherent. The comparison trap is particularly vicious in our modern world, where social media provides an endless stream of curated highlight reels to measure yourself against. But the roots of this pattern run much deeper than technology. They reach back to childhood experiences of competition, to messages about worth and value, to the fundamental human need to belong and the fear of being left behind. When you are caught in the comparison trap, you cannot enjoy your own achievements because someone else has always achieved more. You cannot appreciate your own journey because someone else appears to be traveling faster. You cannot celebrate your own progress because someone else seems to have started from a better position or reached a more impressive destination. This pattern turns life into a zero-sum game where someone else's success diminishes your own worth. It creates a chronic sense of inadequacy, a feeling that you are always falling short, always behind, always lacking whatever it is that everyone else seems to have figured out. It transforms joy into competition and gratitude into resentment. But comparison is not just about envy or jealousy. It is about the deeper wound of not knowing your own value, of having never developed an internal compass for measuring your own worth. When you do not know who you are apart from how you stack up against others, you become dependent on external validation for your sense of self. You become a refugee in your own life, always looking elsewhere for the home you cannot find within yourself. The comparison trap also creates what I call the authenticity paradox. The more you focus on how you measure up to others, the further you drift from your own authentic path. You begin to want what others have not because it genuinely calls to you, but because it represents success, happiness, or worthiness in the collective imagination. You start living someone else's definition of a good life, while your own soul slowly starves for expression. This pattern is particularly devastating because it operates in the shadows of consciousness. You may not even realize you are measuring yourself against others. It happens automatically, unconsciously, like breathing. You see someone's success and feel a pang of inadequacy. You witness someone's happiness and question your own contentment. You observe someone's lifestyle and suddenly your own choices feel insufficient. The comparison trap creates what I call the stolen present. When you are constantly evaluating your life against external standards, you cannot be fully present to your own experience. You are always somewhere else, in some imagined future where you have caught up, or in some idealized version of someone else's reality. The present moment, which is the only place where genuine happiness can be found, becomes a way station rather than a destination. I recall working with a man who had achieved considerable success in his field, yet he remained perpetually dissatisfied. During our conversations, it became clear that he had never learned to experience his own accomplishments without immediately contextualizing them against the achievements of his peers. Every victory felt hollow because someone else had won bigger. Every milestone felt meaningless because someone else had reached it sooner or more elegantly. This man had developed what I came to understand as comparative consciousness. He could not experience his own life directly. Everything had to be filtered through the lens of how it measured against someone else's experience. He had lost the capacity for what I call first-person joy, the ability to feel happiness that is not dependent on relative positioning in some imagined hierarchy. The comparison trap also feeds on incomplete information. You compare your inner reality, with all its doubts and struggles and imperfections, to someone else's outer presentation, with all its careful curation and selective disclosure. You measure your behind the scenes against someone else's highlight reel, your rough draft against their published work, your vulnerable truth against their polished performance. This creates a fundamental distortion in how you perceive reality. You begin to believe that everyone else has figured out some secret to happiness that you are missing. You assume that their lives are easier, their struggles lighter, their paths clearer. You forget that every human being is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying wounds you cannot see, wrestling with demons that wear familiar faces. The third hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the control illusion. This is the unconscious belief that you can manage, manipulate, or micromanage your way to contentment. It is the fantasy that if you can just control enough variables, anticipate enough outcomes, and prepare for enough contingencies, you can create a life free from uncertainty, disappointment, or pain. The control illusion manifests in countless ways. You might find yourself obsessively planning for every possible scenario, unable to make decisions because you cannot guarantee the outcome, or constantly trying to manage other people's emotions and reactions to avoid conflict or rejection. You might hoard resources out of fear of future scarcity, or refuse to take risks because you cannot control the results. On the surface, this pattern appears to be wisdom. After all, planning is good. Preparation is sensible. Taking precautions is responsible. But when the need for control becomes compulsive, when it begins to dominate your decision-making process, it transforms from a useful tool into a prison of anxiety and limitation. The control illusion is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of life itself. Life is inherently uncertain. Change is the only constant. No amount of planning, preparation, or precaution can eliminate the basic unpredictability of existence. When you try to control what cannot be controlled, you waste enormous amounts of energy fighting against the natural flow of reality. This pattern creates what I call the happiness postponement syndrome. You tell yourself that you will be happy once you have enough control over your circumstances. Once you have saved enough money, once you have found the perfect relationship, once you have secured the ideal job, once you have eliminated all the variables that make you anxious, then you will finally be able to relax and enjoy your life. But that day never comes, because there are always new variables to control, new uncertainties to manage, new contingencies to prepare for. The need for control is like hunger. It can never be permanently satisfied. The more you feed it, the hungrier it becomes. The more you try to eliminate uncertainty from your life, the more sensitive you become to whatever uncertainty remains. I once encountered a woman who had built her entire life around the principle of risk management. She had a stable career, substantial savings, comprehensive insurance policies, and detailed emergency plans for every conceivable crisis. Yet she lived in a constant state of anxiety, always anticipating the next potential disaster, always preparing for problems that might never materialize. This woman had confused security with happiness, control with peace. She had optimized her life for safety at the expense of aliveness. She had created an existence so insulated from risk that it had also become insulated from joy, spontaneity, and authentic connection. Her need for control had become a form of emotional armor, that protected her from pain but also prevented her from fully experiencing pleasure. The control illusion also creates what I call the delegation dilemma. When you believe that your happiness depends on controlling external circumstances, you inevitably find yourself trying to control other people. You attempt to manage their moods, their decisions, their responses to you. You take responsibility for outcomes that are not yours to control, and you resent others when they do not behave according to your plans. This pattern is particularly destructive in relationships. The person caught in the control illusion cannot simply love others as they are. They must constantly be trying to improve them, fix them, or guide them toward better choices. They cannot allow others the dignity of their own mistakes or the freedom of their own paths. Love becomes management, and intimacy becomes a strategic endeavor. The fourth hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the approval addiction. This is the unconscious dependence on external validation for your sense of worth. The belief that your value as a human being is determined by how others perceive you, respond to you, or feel about you. The approval addiction is one of the most common and most devastating patterns I encounter in my work. It turns you into a performer in your own life, constantly adjusting your behavior, your opinions, your very personality to earn positive responses from others. You become a chameleon, changing colors to match whatever environment you find yourself in, losing touch with your own authentic preferences and desires. This pattern often begins in childhood, when approval from parents and authority figures is literally a matter of survival. Children who learn that love is conditional on good behavior, high achievement, or emotional caretaking often carry this programming into adulthood. They continue to seek approval long after they have the power to validate themselves, long after they have the resources to meet their own needs. The approval addiction creates what I call the authentic self-exile. In your constant effort to be liked, accepted, and approved of, you gradually abandon the parts of yourself that might be controversial, challenging, or difficult for others to accept. You edit yourself into a version that is more palatable, more agreeable, more conventionally attractive. But in doing so, you exile the very essence of who you truly are. This pattern is particularly insidious because it often leads to success in traditional terms. The approval addict frequently becomes highly accomplished, well-liked, and socially successful. They excel at reading social cues, meeting expectations, and giving others what they want. From the outside, their lives appear charming and enviable, but on the inside, they feel like hollow performers, always on stage, never able to rest in the simple fact of their own existence. The approval addiction also creates what I call the opinion prison. When your sense of self is dependent on how others perceive you, you become a prisoner to every judgment, every criticism, every sideways glance. You cannot make decisions based on your own inner knowing because you are too busy calculating how those decisions will be received by others. You cannot express your authentic thoughts because you are too concerned with whether those thoughts will be popular, acceptable, or safe. This pattern turns every interaction into a performance evaluation. You are constantly monitoring the reactions of others, adjusting your behavior in real time based on the feedback you receive. A frown becomes evidence of your failure. A lack of enthusiasm becomes proof of your inadequacy. An absent response becomes confirmation of your unworthiness. You live at the mercy of other people's moods, opinions, and emotional states. But perhaps most tragically, the approval addiction prevents you from developing what I call internal authority. When you are always looking outside yourself for validation, you never learn to trust your own judgment, your own instincts, your own wisdom. You become dependent on others not just for emotional regulation, but for basic decision-making. You cannot know what you want because you are too busy wanting what others want you to want. I once worked with a man who had built an impressive career in a field he secretly despised. He had chosen this path not because it called to him, but because it impressed others. He had married a woman not because she stirred his soul, but because she looked good on his arm at social gatherings. He had crafted an entire existence designed to earn applause from an audience he did not even respect. This man came to me in a state of profound disconnection from himself. He could tell you what others thought about every aspect of his life, but he could not tell you what he himself genuinely enjoyed, desired, or valued. He had become so skilled at reading and responding to external cues that he had lost the ability to hear his own inner voice. The approval addiction had turned him into a sophisticated puppet, dancing to strings he could not even see. The fifth hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the scarcity trance. This is the unconscious belief that there is not enough love, not enough success, not enough time, not enough resources, not enough opportunities to go around. It is the conviction that life is a zero-sum game where someone else's gain necessarily means your loss. The scarcity trance operates like a filter over your perception of reality. It causes you to focus on what is missing rather than what is present, on what you lack rather than what you possess, on what might be taken away rather than what is being offered. This pattern creates a chronic state of anxiety and grasping, a feeling that you must constantly be acquiring, hoarding, or protecting whatever good fortune comes your way. When you are caught in the scarcity trance, you cannot fully enjoy what you have because you are always worried about losing it. You cannot celebrate others' successes because their achievements feel like evidence that less is available for you. You cannot give generously because giving feels like depleting a finite resource. You cannot rest in abundance because abundance feels temporary, precarious, likely to disappear at any moment. This pattern manifests in countless subtle ways. You might find yourself unable to throw away items you never use because they might be needed someday. You might hoard compliments, attention, or affection because you believe they are rare commodities. You might avoid taking vacations because you fear missing opportunities for advancement. You might stay in unsatisfying relationships because you believe better options are scarce. The scarcity trance also creates what I call the gratitude paradox. While you may intellectually understand the importance of gratitude, you find it difficult to genuinely feel grateful because gratitude requires a sense of abundance, a recognition that you have been given something valuable. But when you are operating from scarcity consciousness, everything feels insufficient, temporary, or threatened. I recall a woman who had achieved considerable material success, yet lived in constant fear of financial ruin. Despite having substantial savings, multiple income streams, and valuable assets, she could not spend money on anything beyond basic necessities without experiencing intense anxiety. She would lie awake at night calculating worst-case scenarios, imagining disasters that would leave her destitute and alone. This woman had inherited more than money from her family. She had inherited their relationship with scarcity. Her grandparents had survived the Great Depression, and the trauma of that experience had been passed down through generations like a genetic code. She carried within her cellular memory the conviction that security was an illusion, that abundance was temporary, that catastrophe was always lurking just around the corner. The scarcity trance prevents you from recognizing the abundance that already exists in your life. You become blind to the countless ways you are supported, nourished, and blessed every day. You take for granted the miracle of your body's functioning, the gift of your relationships, the privilege of your opportunities. You focus so intently on what might go wrong that you miss what is going right. This pattern also creates what I call the competitive consciousness. When you believe that resources are limited, you inevitably find yourself in competition with others for access to those resources. Other people's success becomes threatening rather than inspiring. Their happiness becomes evidence of your own lack. Their good fortune becomes proof that the universe is unfair, that you are being cheated, that life is stacked against you. The sixth hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the future fixation. This is the unconscious habit of living everywhere except the present moment, of constantly projecting your attention into an imagined future where your real life is supposed to begin. It is the belief that happiness is always one achievement, one relationship, one breakthrough away from your current reality. The future fixation manifests as chronic postponement of satisfaction. You tell yourself that you will be happy when you graduate, when you get promoted, when you find love, when you lose weight, when you buy a house, when you retire. The present moment becomes merely a stepping stone to some future state where you will finally be allowed to enjoy your life. This pattern is particularly seductive because it masquerades as ambition, as goal setting, as having vision for your life. But there is a crucial difference between healthy planning and future fixation. Healthy planning acknowledges that goals are important while recognizing that life is happening now. Future fixation treats the present as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be lived. When you are caught in future fixation, you cannot be fully present to the people in your life because you are always somewhere else, in some imagined tomorrow where everything will be different. You cannot enjoy simple pleasures because they feel like distractions from your real purpose. You cannot rest in the moment because the moment never feels significant enough, important enough, worthy of your full attention. The future fixation creates what I call the arrival fallacy. You believe that happiness is a destination you will eventually reach rather than a way of traveling. You imagine that once you arrive at your desired future, all your problems will be solved, all your needs will be met, all your dreams will be fulfilled. But life has a way of revealing the emptiness of this fantasy. Each achievement simply reveals new problems to solve, new goals to pursue, new futures to fixate upon. I once encountered a man who had spent his entire adult life working toward retirement. He had sacrificed present pleasure, present relationships, present experiences in service of a future where he would finally have time to enjoy his life. But when retirement finally arrived, he discovered that he had forgotten how to enjoy anything. He had become so skilled at deferring gratification that he had lost the capacity for immediate satisfaction. This man had committed what I call temporal suicide. He had killed his present self in service of an imagined future self who never materialized. He had spent decades preparing for a life he had forgotten how to live. The future fixation had robbed him not just of happiness, but of the very ability to recognize happiness when it appeared. The seventh and perhaps most hidden sign that you are sabotaging your own happiness is what I call the meaning mirage. This is the unconscious belief that your life must have some grand purpose, some cosmic significance, some meaningful contribution to justify your existence. It is the conviction that ordinary life, with its simple pleasures and mundane responsibilities, is somehow insufficient or unworthy of your full engagement. The meaning mirage creates a peculiar form of suffering where you reject the happiness that is available to you because it does not feel important enough, significant enough, or meaningful enough. You cannot enjoy a quiet evening at home because it feels like wasted potential. You cannot appreciate small victories because they pale in comparison to the world-changing impact you believe you should be having. This pattern often affects highly intelligent, sensitive, or creative individuals who have been told they are special, that they have unique gifts, that they are destined for greatness. While these messages may have been well-intentioned, they can create an impossible burden of expectation that makes ordinary human happiness feel like settling, like betraying your potential, like living beneath your calling. The meaning mirage manifests as chronic dissatisfaction with whatever you are currently doing. If you are working in a corporate job, you believe you should be creating art. If you are creating art, you believe you should be changing the world. If you are changing the world, you believe you should be doing it faster, bigger, with more impact. Nothing feels significant enough to warrant your full presence and engagement. But here is what the meaning mirage obscures. Meaning is not something you find or create through grand gestures or world-changing achievements. Meaning emerges from the quality of attention you bring to whatever you are doing, the depth of presence you offer to whatever life is presenting you with in this moment. The most meaningful life might be the one where you love deeply, listen carefully, and show up fully to the ordinary miracle of being human. The meaning mirage also creates what I call the significance spiral. You become so focused on finding or creating meaning that you lose the ability to simply be. Every experience must be profound. Every relationship must be transformative. Every day must contribute to some larger narrative about your purpose on earth. But life cannot sustain this level of intensity. Most of existence is made up of ordinary moments, simple interactions, mundane tasks that serve no greater purpose than their own completion. When you are caught in the meaning mirage, you cannot wash dishes without wondering if you should be writing poetry instead. You cannot enjoy a conversation with a neighbor without questioning whether you should be networking with more influential people. You cannot read a book for pleasure without feeling guilty that you are not studying something more relevant to your mission. Every moment becomes a referendum on whether you are living up to your potential. I once worked with a woman who had been paralyzed by her own sense of destiny. She believed she was meant to do something important with her life, but she could never identify what that something was. This belief had prevented her from committing fully to anything. Every job felt temporary, every relationship felt like a detour, every choice felt like it might be closing the door on her true calling. She lived in a constant state of readiness for a summons that never came. This woman had confused meaning with magnitude. She believed that significance was measured in scale, that importance was determined by public recognition, that a life worth living must leave visible marks on the world. But she had never considered that meaning might be found in the smallest gestures, the quietest moments, the most private acts of love and attention. The meaning mirage prevents you from recognizing the sacred in the ordinary. You become blind to the profound beauty of preparing a meal for someone you love. The deep satisfaction of completing a task well, the quiet joy of watching sunlight move across a wall. You dismiss these experiences as trivial because they do not fit your narrative of significance, but in doing so, you exile yourself from the very moments where true contentment resides. This pattern also creates what I call the comparison of callings. You measure your sense of purpose against the apparent missions of others, believing that some vocations are inherently more meaningful than others. The artist believes the activist is more important. The activist believes the healer is more necessary. The healer believes the teacher touches more lives. Everyone is somewhere else, doing something more significant, living with greater purpose. But meaning is not a hierarchy. It is not a competition. The person who brings genuine presence to raising a child is no less significant than the person who brings genuine presence to leading a movement. The individual who shows up fully to their work as an accountant is no less meaningful than the individual who shows up fully to their work as a humanitarian. Significance is not determined by external recognition, but by internal authenticity. The meaning mirage also feeds on what I call the legacy anxiety. You become preoccupied with how you will be remembered, what mark you will leave, whether your life will have mattered after you are gone. This concern with posterity robs you of presence, causing you to live for an imagined future audience rather than for the actual experience of being alive right now. You begin to curate your life like a museum exhibit, making choices based on how they will look in retrospect rather than how they feel in the moment. You pursue achievements that will survive you rather than experiences that nourish you. You craft a narrative of your existence that sounds impressive when told, but feels hollow when lived. What makes all 7 of these patterns so destructive is that they operate beneath the threshold of consciousness. You do not wake up one morning and decide to sabotage your happiness. Instead, these patterns emerge gradually, invisibly, like shadows lengthening at dusk. They feel like wisdom, like protection, like the natural way to navigate a complex and uncertain world. The perfection prison feels like having high standards. The comparison trap feels like staying motivated. The control illusion feels like being responsible. The approval addiction feels like being considerate. The scarcity trance feels like being practical. The future fixation feels like being goal-oriented. The meaning mirage feels like being purposeful. But each of these patterns shares a common thread. They all involve rejecting the present moment in favor of some imagined alternative. They all require you to be somewhere other than where you are, someone other than who you are, living some life other than the one you actually have. This rejection of what is in favor of what should be is the root of all psychological suffering. It is the fundamental split that separates you from your own experience, your own contentment, your own capacity for joy. When you are constantly measuring your reality against an ideal, you cannot fully inhabit your reality. When you are perpetually preparing for some future moment, you cannot be present to this moment. The antidote to these patterns is not willpower or positive thinking or self-improvement strategies. It is awareness. It is the cultivation of a witnessing consciousness that can observe these patterns without being consumed by them. It is the development of what I call the neutral observer, the part of you that can watch your mind creating suffering without being swept away by the drama. This witnessing consciousness does not judge or try to fix or immediately change anything. It simply notices. It observes the perfectionist as it drives you toward impossible standards. It watches the comparison trap as it steals your contentment. It sees the control illusion as it generates anxiety about things beyond your influence. When you can observe these patterns with compassion rather than criticism, they begin to lose their power over you. Not because you have conquered them or transcended them, but because you have stopped being unconsciously identified with them. You begin to see them as visitors in the house of your psyche rather than as the owners of that house. This shift in perspective is subtle but profound. Instead of saying, "I am a perfectionist," you begin to notice perfectionism is arising. Instead of believing, "I need approval," you observe the approval-seeking pattern is activated. Instead of assuming, "I must control this situation," you recognize the control impulse is present. This witnessing awareness creates space between you and your patterns, room to breathe, freedom to choose a different response. Not because you have eliminated these tendencies, but because you are no longer unconsciously enslaved by them. You begin to see that you are not your patterns any more than you are your thoughts or your emotions. You are the awareness in which all these phenomena arise and pass away. But this awareness must be cultivated with patience and gentleness. These patterns developed over years or decades as adaptive responses to difficult circumstances. They served a purpose once, even if that purpose has outlived its usefulness. To approach them with aggression or judgment only strengthens their grip by creating the very dynamic they were designed to protect you from. The path toward genuine happiness is not about becoming someone different, but about returning to who you have always been beneath the layers of protection and adaptation. It is about remembering the part of you that existed before you learned to be perfect, before you learned to compare, before you learned that love must be earned and safety must be controlled. This original self, this unconditioned awareness, does not need to achieve happiness because it is happiness. It does not need to find meaning because it is meaning. It does not need to control outcomes because it trusts the process. It does not need approval because it knows its own worth. It does not need more because it recognizes abundance. It does not need the future because it is fully alive to the present. The journey back to this essential self requires what I call the great turning inward. Instead of constantly looking outside yourself for validation, security, or fulfillment, you must learn to find these qualities within your own being. This is not narcissism or self-absorption. It is the recognition that the happiness you seek in the external world already exists in the internal world, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be lived. This turning inward is not a retreat from the world, but a deepening into reality. It is the difference between skimming across the surface of existence and diving into the depths where true nourishment awaits. But this descent requires courage because it means facing the parts of yourself you have spent years avoiding. The wounds you have covered with achievement, the emptiness you have filled with busyness, the fear you have masked with control. Most people resist this inward journey because they have been conditioned to believe that happiness comes from external acquisition rather than internal recognition. They have been taught that fulfillment is something you earn rather than something you uncover, something you achieve rather than something you allow. This conditioning runs so deep that the suggestion of looking within can feel like giving up, like settling, like abandoning the very mechanisms that seem to promise eventual satisfaction. But here is what I have observed in decades of working with human consciousness. The external world can only reflect back to you what already exists within your internal landscape. If you are fragmented inside, no amount of external wholeness will satisfy you. If you are empty within, no amount of external fullness will nourish you. If you are at war with yourself, no amount of external peace will bring you rest. The patterns we have explored are not personal failings, but collective symptoms of a culture that has forgotten the most fundamental truth about human nature. You are already complete. Not complete in the sense that you need nothing, want nothing, require no growth or change or connection. Complete in the sense that your essential worth does not depend on anything you do, achieve, or become. Your value is not earned but inherent, not proven but given, not created but revealed. This completeness is not a concept to be understood, but a reality to be embodied. It cannot be grasped by the mind because the mind is the very mechanism that creates the illusion of incompleteness. The mind's job is to identify problems and seek solutions, to find what is missing and figure out how to acquire it. This function serves you well in practical matters, but when applied to your fundamental sense of worth, it becomes a source of endless suffering. The mind cannot solve the problem of happiness because happiness is not a problem to be solved. It is a state of being to be inhabited, a natural condition to be restored, an original wholeness to be remembered. When you try to think your way to contentment, you engage the very faculty that generates discontentment. When you try to achieve your way to fulfillment, you activate the very patterns that create emptiness. This is why the 7 signs of self-sabotage are so persistent and so subtle. They masquerade as solutions while perpetuating the very problems they claim to address. The perfectionist believes that achieving flawlessness will bring peace, but perfectionism itself is what destroys peace. The approval seeker believes that earning validation will create security, but the need for approval is what generates insecurity. Each pattern contains within it a grain of wisdom that has been distorted by unconscious programming. The desire for excellence that underlies perfectionism is not inherently destructive. The awareness of others that feeds the approval addiction is not fundamentally flawed. The planning impulse that creates the control illusion is not essentially problematic. These tendencies become pathological only when they are unconscious, compulsive, and identified with your sense of self. When these patterns operate below the threshold of awareness, they function like invisible puppet strings, pulling you in directions you did not consciously choose, creating experiences you did not deliberately design. You find yourself exhausted by standards you never consciously set, anxious about outcomes you cannot actually influence, performing for audiences you do not even respect. The liberation from these patterns begins with what I call the sacred pause. This is the moment when you catch yourself in the middle of a familiar cycle and simply stop. Not to judge or fix or immediately change anything, but to create a space of conscious awareness in which something new becomes possible. In this pause, you might notice the perfectionist as it begins its familiar critique of your work. Instead of automatically accepting this voice as truth or fighting against it as enemy, you simply observe it with curiosity. What is this voice really trying to protect? What ancient wound is it attempting to heal? What fundamental fear is it working to avoid? When you approach your patterns with this kind of compassionate inquiry, they begin to reveal their deeper purposes. The perfectionist is often trying to ensure that you will never again experience the shame of being seen as inadequate. The comparison trap is frequently attempting to protect you from the pain of being left behind or forgotten. The control illusion is usually working to prevent the terror of being helpless in the face of life's uncertainties. These patterns are not enemies to be conquered, but parts of yourself that have been working overtime to keep you safe. They developed in response to real threats, real pain, real experiences of vulnerability that felt unbearable at the time. To approach them with aggression only confirms their belief that the world is dangerous and that their vigilance is necessary. The healing of these patterns requires what I call therapeutic presence. This is the quality of attention that can hold your own suffering with the same compassion you would offer to a frightened child. It does not minimize the pain or rush to solve the problem. It simply creates a safe space in which the frozen parts of your psyche can begin to thaw. This presence is not something you develop through effort or technique, but something you remember through practice. It is the same awareness that comforted you when you were hurt as a child, the same love that celebrates your victories and mourns your losses, the same wisdom that knows your worth regardless of your performance. When you learn to offer this presence to your own patterns of self-sabotage, something miraculous begins to happen. The patterns do not necessarily disappear, but they lose their compulsive quality. They become visitors in your psychological house rather than its permanent residence. You begin to have a relationship with them rather than being unconsciously identified with them. This shift creates what I call conscious choice. Instead of being driven by unconscious patterns, you begin to make deliberate decisions about how to respond to life's challenges. You might still notice the perfectionist voice, but you are no longer compelled to obey it. You might still feel the pull of comparison, but you are no longer enslaved by it. This consciousness does not eliminate all difficulty from your life. You will still face challenges, experience disappointments, encounter situations that trigger your old patterns. But you will meet these experiences with awareness rather than reactivity, with presence rather than avoidance, with curiosity rather than resistance. The cultivation of this consciousness is not a destination you arrive at, but a practice you engage in moment by moment, day by day, year by year. Some days you will be more aware than others. Some situations will trigger your patterns more intensely than others. This is not failure, but humanity, not regression, but the natural rhythm of growth and integration. What matters is not the perfection of your awareness, but the sincerity of your intention to wake up, to show up, to inhabit your own life more fully. Each moment of conscious recognition, each pause before reacting, each gentle return to presence is a victory, not because it changes everything, but because it changes something. This something is the most important something of all, your relationship with yourself. When you begin to meet your own patterns with compassion rather than judgment, your own struggles with curiosity rather than criticism, your own humanity with acceptance rather than resistance, you create an internal environment in which genuine happiness can flourish. This happiness is not the fleeting pleasure that comes from getting what you want or avoiding what you fear. It is the deeper satisfaction that emerges from being fully present to what is exactly as it is, without the constant need to improve, control, or escape your experience. This presence-based happiness does not depend on external circumstances aligning with your preferences. It does not require others to behave in ways that make you comfortable. It does not need the future to unfold according to your plans. It exists in the simple fact of your own awareness, your own aliveness, your own capacity to witness the miracle of existence from the inside. When you rest in this awareness, the 7 patterns of self-sabotage begin to seem less like personal flaws and more like universal human tendencies. You recognize them not just in yourself but in everyone around you. This recognition breeds not superiority but compassion, not judgment but understanding, not separation but connection. You begin to see that everyone is struggling with their own versions of these patterns. The colleague who seems so confident is wrestling with their own approval addiction. The friend who appears so successful is trapped in their own comparison cycle. The family member who seems so controlling is terrified of their own helplessness. This recognition does not excuse harmful behavior or eliminate the need for boundaries, but it does dissolve the story that you are uniquely flawed, uniquely broken, uniquely unable to find happiness. You see that the human condition includes these struggles not as bugs but as features, not as problems to be solved, but as experiences to be integrated. The integration of these patterns is the work of a lifetime, not because it is difficult, but because it is ongoing. Life continues to present new situations that activate old responses. Growth continues to reveal new layers of conditioning that require conscious attention. Healing continues to unfold in spirals rather than straight lines, but each cycle through these patterns becomes an opportunity for deeper understanding rather than proof of failure. Each activation becomes a chance to practice presence rather than evidence of regression. Each moment of unconsciousness becomes a doorway back to awareness rather than a reason for self-judgment. This cyclical nature of psychological growth mirrors the rhythms of nature itself. Trees do not grow straight up, but in rings, adding layer upon layer of strength and stability. Rivers do not flow in straight lines, but carve meandering paths that honor the landscape they move through. Seasons do not progress linearly, but cycle through repeated patterns of death and rebirth, dormancy and flowering. Your journey toward happiness follows these same organic rhythms. There will be seasons of rapid growth and periods of apparent stagnation. There will be moments of crystal clarity and times of confusing complexity. There will be breakthroughs that feel like permanent transformation and breakdowns that feel like starting over. All of this is not only normal but necessary. The patterns that sabotage your happiness did not develop overnight, and they will not dissolve overnight. They are woven into the fabric of your personality, embedded in your nervous system, encoded in your cellular memory. Their transformation requires patience, persistence, and above all, compassion for the gradual nature of real change. This compassion extends not only to yourself, but to the patterns themselves. They are not invaders that have colonized your psyche, but protective mechanisms that have been working on your behalf, often for decades. To heal them, you must first honor them, acknowledge their service, and gently help them understand that their intense vigilance is no longer required. This process is less like performing surgery and more like conducting diplomacy. You are not trying to eliminate parts of yourself, but to help all parts of yourself work together more harmoniously. You are not trying to achieve some state of psychological perfection, but to create more conscious cooperation among the various aspects of your inner world. The ultimate goal is not the elimination of all psychological patterns, but the cultivation of what I call conscious participation in your own experience. This means showing up fully to whatever is arising in your life without being unconsciously driven by it, without being compulsively reactive to it, without being helplessly identified with it. This conscious participation is what transforms the 7 signs of self-sabotage from unconscious compulsions into conscious choices. You might still notice perfectionist tendencies, but you can choose when to honor them and when to let them go. You might still feel the pull of comparison, but you can decide whether to follow that pull or return your attention to your own path. The freedom that emerges from this consciousness is not the freedom from having human patterns, but the freedom to dance with them consciously rather than being unconsciously danced by them. It is the freedom to be fully human without being enslaved by your humanity, to feel deeply without being overwhelmed by your feelings, to care passionately without being destroyed by your caring. This freedom opens the door to a different kind of happiness, one that is not dependent on getting your way but on being present to whatever way life unfolds. It is a happiness that can coexist with sadness, a peace that can embrace turmoil, a love that can include disappointment. This mature happiness does not promise that life will be easy, or that pain will disappear, or that all your dreams will come true. It offers something more sustainable, the capacity to find meaning and beauty and even joy in whatever circumstances arise, not because those circumstances are perfect, but because your relationship with them has been transformed. The transformation of this relationship is the real work, the sacred work, the work that matters more than any external achievement or acquisition. It is the work of coming home to yourself, of befriending your own experience, of learning to love your life not because it matches some ideal, but because it is yours. This homecoming is not a destination you reach, but a way of travelling. Not a problem you solve, but a mystery you inhabit. Not a goal you achieve, but a grace you receive. It unfolds not through effort, but through surrender. Not through forcing, but through allowing. Not through becoming someone different, but through remembering who you have always been. In this remembering, the 7 signs of self-sabotage reveal themselves as 7 invitations to consciousness, 7 opportunities for awakening, 7 doorways back to the happiness that has been waiting patiently within you all along. This happiness has been there through every moment of seeking, every hour of striving, every year of believing you were broken. It has watched with infinite patience as you chased miracles in distant lands while standing on sacred ground. It has waited with unwavering love as you searched for treasure in every vault except the one within your own chest. The recognition of this ever-present happiness is what I call the great remembering. It is not a psychological technique or a spiritual practice, but a simple turning of attention from what you lack to what you are, from what you need to become to what you have never stopped being, from the story of your incompleteness to the truth of your wholeness. This remembering cannot be forced or manufactured through willpower and determination. It emerges naturally when the seeking stops, when the patterns exhaust themselves, when you finally become too tired to run from your own experience. In that exhaustion, something miraculous happens. The very thing you have been fleeing toward reveals itself to have been with you all along. I recall a moment in my own journey when this recognition struck with the force of lightning. I had been wrestling with every pattern we have discussed, driving myself toward impossible standards while comparing my progress to others, trying to control outcomes while seeking approval, living in scarcity while fixated on some imagined future where meaning would finally reveal itself. In that moment of complete internal collapse, when every strategy had failed and every hope had been exhausted, I found myself sitting in the most ordinary of circumstances. Nothing had changed externally. The same challenges remained, the same uncertainties loomed, the same human limitations persisted. But something had shifted in the very ground of my being. The happiness I had been seeking through achievement was there in the simple fact of breathing. The peace I had tried to create through control was present in the surrender to what I could not manage. The love I had attempted to earn through perfection was flowing freely in the acceptance of my own flawed humanity. This was not a mystical experience or a transcendent state, but the most natural thing in the world. It was like remembering how to walk after years of believing you needed to learn some complex form of locomotion. It was like discovering that the key to your house had been in your pocket all along while you searched frantically through every drawer and cabinet. The ordinariness of this recognition is what makes it so easy to miss and so difficult to believe. We have been conditioned to expect that real transformation must be dramatic, that genuine insight must be profound, that authentic awakening must be accompanied by celestial choirs and mystical visions. But the deepest truths are often the simplest ones. The most profound realizations frequently arrive wearing the clothes of common sense. The most transformative insights usually feel less like discoveries and more like remembrances of something you have always known but temporarily forgotten. When you recognize that happiness is not a destination but your natural state, the entire game changes. The 7 patterns of self-sabotage do not disappear, but they lose their grip on your identity. They become weather patterns moving through the sky of your awareness rather than the sky itself. You might still notice the perfectionist voice, but it no longer defines your worth. You might still feel the pull of comparison, but it no longer determines your value. You might still experience the urge to control, but it no longer drives your decisions. You might still seek approval, but you no longer depend on it for survival. This shift is subtle but revolutionary. It is the difference between being tossed about by every psychological wind and remaining rooted in the unchanging ground of your being. It is the difference between being a victim of your patterns and being a conscious participant in your own transformation. From this grounded place, you begin to relate to your patterns with curiosity rather than conflict, with interest rather than identification. You watch them arise and pass away like clouds in an empty sky, neither grasping after them nor pushing them away, simply witnessing their movement with the detached fascination of a scientist observing natural phenomena. This witnessing consciousness reveals something extraordinary. These patterns are not personal flaws, but impersonal processes, not individual failures, but universal human tendencies, not evidence of your brokenness, but proof of your membership in the grand community of conscious beings who struggle with the same fundamental challenges. This recognition dissolves the isolation that so often accompanies psychological suffering. You are not alone in your perfectionism, unique in your need for approval, or singular in your fear of uncertainty. You are participating in the most common human experience, the journey from unconsciousness to awareness, from reaction to response, from suffering to freedom. But this freedom is not the absence of challenge or the elimination of difficulty. It is the capacity to meet whatever arises with presence rather than resistance, with curiosity rather than judgment, with love rather than fear. It is the ability to remain open to your experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable, uncertain, or unwelcome. This openness is perhaps the most radical act you can perform in a culture that teaches you to close down, shut off, and shut out anything that threatens your carefully constructed sense of safety and control. To remain open in the face of uncertainty, vulnerable in the presence of judgment, authentic despite the risk of rejection, this is the courage that transforms not only your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. When you stop hiding from your humanity, you give others permission to stop hiding from theirs. When you cease performing perfection, you create space for others to embrace their own imperfections. When you release the need for approval, you free others from the burden of managing your emotions. When you abandon the illusion of control, you invite others into the freedom of authenticity. This is how individual transformation becomes collective healing. Your willingness to face your own patterns of self-sabotage creates ripples that extend far beyond your personal sphere of influence. Each moment of consciousness, each choice for authenticity, each act of self-compassion contributes to the collective awakening of human potential. But this contribution happens not through preaching or teaching or trying to fix others, but through the simple act of being genuinely yourself. Your presence becomes the invitation, your authenticity becomes the permission, your freedom becomes the demonstration that another way of living is possible. This other way is not a new technique or a revolutionary method, but the most ancient path of all. The return to what you have never actually left, the discovery of what you have never truly lost, the remembering of what you have never really forgotten. It is the path of coming home to yourself, not as an improved version or a perfected model, but as the gloriously imperfect, beautifully human, magnificently ordinary being you have always been. In this homecoming, happiness reveals itself not as a reward for good behavior or a prize for spiritual achievement, but as the very essence of what you are when all the masks are removed, all the performances are ended, all the seeking is surrendered. It is not something you attain, but something you uncover. Not something you create, but something you allow. Not something you become, but something you remember being. The journey from self-sabotage to self-acceptance is ultimately a journey from exile to homecoming, from fragmentation to wholeness, from the belief that you are broken to the recognition that you are exactly as you need to be in this moment for your own awakening and the awakening of all beings. This recognition does not make you passive or complacent. It does not eliminate the desire for growth or the impulse toward improvement. Instead, it provides a foundation of unconditional acceptance from which authentic change can emerge naturally, organically, without the violence of self-rejection or the desperation of inadequacy. When you know that you are already whole, you can work on yourself without being driven by the belief that you are fundamentally flawed. When you recognize that you are already worthy, you can seek improvement without being motivated by shame or self-hatred. When you understand that you are already enough, you can grow and change from love rather than fear. This love-based transformation is qualitatively different from fear-based change. It unfolds with the gentle persistence of a flower opening to the sun rather than the forced effort of a machine grinding toward efficiency. It honors the natural rhythms of growth and integration rather than demanding immediate results and permanent fixes. Most importantly, it includes setbacks as part of the process, rather than treating them as evidence of failure. When you inevitably find yourself caught in old patterns, trapped by familiar compulsions, driven by unconscious impulses, you meet these experiences with the compassion you would offer a child learning to walk rather than the criticism you might direct toward a machine that has malfunctioned. This compassionate approach to your own imperfection is perhaps the most radical departure from the patterns of self-sabotage. Instead of using your mistakes as ammunition for self-attack, you use them as opportunities for self-understanding. Instead of treating your limitations as proof of inadequacy, you embrace them as evidence of humanity. In this embrace, something extraordinary happens. The very patterns that once seemed like obstacles to happiness reveal themselves as gateways to a deeper, more sustainable form of contentment. The perfectionist drive that once created suffering becomes a source of excellence without attachment. The comparison tendency that once generated envy transforms into appreciation for diversity. The control impulse that once created anxiety becomes skillful planning without attachment to outcomes. This transformation does not happen through suppression or elimination, but through integration and consciousness. You do not destroy the parts of yourself that create suffering. You help them remember their original purpose and find healthier ways of fulfilling that purpose. The perfectionist learns to appreciate excellence without demanding flawlessness. The approval seeker discovers how to value feedback without depending on validation. The controller finds ways to influence what can be influenced while accepting what cannot be changed. Each pattern finds its rightful place in the ecosystem of your psyche, contributing its gifts without dominating your experience. This inner harmony creates what I call effortless effort. You continue to work, strive, and grow, but from a place of wholeness rather than inadequacy, from love rather than fear, from inspiration rather than desperation. Your actions become expressions of your authentic nature rather than attempts to fix your perceived brokenness. The happiness that emerges from this integration is not the fleeting high of temporary pleasure, but the steady warmth of deep contentment. It does not depend on getting your way, but on being present to whatever way life unfolds. It does not require perfect circumstances, but finds perfection in whatever circumstances arise. This mature happiness can coexist with sadness, embrace uncertainty, and include disappointment without being diminished by these experiences. It is not the happiness of getting what you want, but the happiness of wanting what you have, not the joy of avoiding difficulty, but the joy of meeting difficulty with grace. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want to leave you with one final recognition. The 7 signs of self-sabotage that we have examined are not enemies to be conquered, but teachers to be honored. They have served as guardians of your heart, protectors of your dreams, and guides on your journey toward authentic selfhood. They arose from love even when they created suffering. They emerged from wisdom, even when they generated confusion. They developed from a deep intelligence that was trying to keep you safe, help you belong, and ensure your survival in a world that often seems hostile to sensitivity, authenticity, and genuine human feeling. To heal these patterns, you must first thank them for their service. To transform them, you must first honor their intention. To release them, you must first embrace them with the same love they have been trying to create for you all along. In this embrace, the circle completes itself. The journey from self-sabotage to self-love reveals itself to have been a journey from self-love to self-love, from wholeness to wholeness, from the happiness you are to the happiness you have always been. The only thing that has changed is your recognition of what was already true. You have not become someone different. You have remembered who you always were. You have not acquired something new. You have uncovered something eternal. You have not solved the problem of your existence. You have dissolved the illusion that there was ever a problem to solve. In this dissolution, happiness reveals itself as your birthright, peace shows itself as your natural state, and love emerges as the very substance of what you are. The 7 signs of self-sabotage transform into 7 invitations to awakening, 7 doorways to freedom, 7 pathways home to the truth of your being. This truth is not complex or esoteric, but simple and immediate. It is as close as your next breath, as available as this present moment, as real as the awareness that is reading these words right now. It requires no special knowledge, no particular technique, no extraordinary circumstances. It asks only that you stop looking elsewhere for what is here. Stop seeking tomorrow for what is now. Stop trying to become what you already are. In this stopping, in this settling, in this simple recognition of what has never been absent, the happiness you have been seeking reveals itself as the happiness you have never stopped being. And in that revelation, the greatest truth of all becomes clear. You were never broken, never inadequate, never lacking in any fundamental way. You were always whole, always worthy, always enough. The only thing that was ever missing was the recognition of what was never absent. That recognition is available now in this moment as you finish reading these words. Not as a concept to understand, but as a reality to inhabit. Not as a goal to achieve, but as a gift to receive. Not as a destination to reach, but as the ground you have been standing on all along. Welcome home.